Do you want like kind of a glib answer or a thoughtful answer?
Mr. Kennedy, I'm Joe Lindsley. I'm an American. I've been in Ukraine every single moment of the pandemic and now of Russia's full-scale invasion. And I want to engage you on what you've said about Ukraine.
Putin every day says, I want to settle the war. Let's negotiate. And Zelensky has said, we're not going to negotiate. But,
for years, from 2014, when Putin seized Crimea, Ukrainians have been negotiating with Russia. But all the while, during all this time of negotiating and talking, Russia was preparing to make its full-scale invasion, which we saw the fruition of that in February 2022. In fact, many Ukrainians were starting to get frustrated with President Zelensky because he was negotiating with the Russians and not preparing for this war. So, no, there was 8 years of talk and negotiating, and this is where it got us.
92, the wall came down in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev said, I'm going to allow you to reunify Germany, but I want your commitment. After that, you will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And we solemnly swore we wouldn't do it. Well, then in 97, we're going to move NATO 1,000 miles to the east and take 15 countries into it and surround the Soviet Union.
If you look at the rhetoric, go back and look at the headlines from before 2022, there was zero desire from NATO to include Ukraine as a member. Zero. Ukraine was begging. They wanted it. They know they needed it. But NATO had zero interest, and they kept lecturing Ukraine. And on the other hand, we've seen other countries also begging to get into NATO, especially now. Why? Because they see what has happened in Ukraine. If you're not in NATO, you're definitely not protected. If you're in NATO, you're probably safe, at least for now. And this is, Putin has helped to expand NATO. Look at Finland and Sweden, two neutral countries. They've given up their neutrality and run into the arms of NATO, begging to get into NATO, because they've seen what's happened in Ukraine, and they don't want Russia to attack them.
We then overthrow the government. In 2014, their elected government, and put in a Western sympathetic government.
Back in 2014, masses of Ukrainians refused to leave the streets. Even when the secret police fired bullets upon them, they refused to leave. I'm sure you're an admirer of the Ottawa truckers and their protests. The Maidan revolution of Ukraine in 2014 is the Ottawa truckers times a million, because it was actually effective. And, the Ottawa protesters left when Trudeau seized their bank accounts. Ukrainians did not leave, even when the secret police fired bullets at them and killed them. They still stayed there. In fact, more people showed up. That revolution of 2014 revitalized the Ukrainian language and culture and identity. And when Russians tried to take like Kharkiv city in 2014, the people stopped it. This is all a project of the State Department. I've never seen such effectiveness from our United States government.
Russia then has to go into Crimea because they have a port at Vladivostok. It's their only warm water port. And they know the new government that we just installed is going to invite the U.S. Navy into their port.
And yes, you're right. Russia did not want to lose its port in Crimea, which it was a vestige of Soviet times, which they held on to. And for a few weeks, that port was totally free in the sense of Putin's grip. And in the spring of 2014, it wasn't just Crimea. Putin tried to take other places in Ukraine. He tried to take Odessa. He tried to take Kharkiv. For one 24-hour period, Russians were controlling Kharkiv, it seemed. But the people said, we don't want to live like that. We want to be free. And so in other places of Ukraine in 2014, the Russians failed to take over this country.
Then the Russians go in. They only send 40,000 people. It's a nation of 44 million people. They clearly do not intend to conquer Ukraine.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Kennedy, but what the hell? The Russians have bombed the hell out of Ukrainian cities, totally erasing places like Mariupol and Bakhmut, which I was able to see not long before it was destroyed. And the Russians continue to pound places like Kharkiv, where I spend a lot of time, and the people refuse to flee. If the people really didn't believe in freedom, if they were okay being part of Russia, why would they stand in their city amid bombs and bullets and artillery fire? And in Kharkiv, for example, that's a Russian-speaking city. People grew up speaking Russian, and they had no problem with it. But now they're so disgusted by what Russia is doing to them that in that city you see a transformation. People are digging down deep into their roots, reviving their language of Ukrainian. And I think as someone who comes from an Irish family, you could appreciate this. The struggle of Ukraine for centuries was the same as the struggle of the Irish. to be free of tyranny, to have your culture, your religion, your faith, your identity, and your freedom.
But they want us back at the negotiating table.
Do you know what, Mr. Kennedy? Now, Ukrainians are exporting, in less than a year, more grain through the Black Sea by fighting back than they did during the entire year when they had that so-called negotiated deal with Russia. Because you can't negotiate with someone that wants to kill you and destroy you and erase you. And if you listen to any of Putin's propaganda, he doesn't believe Ukraine should exist as a nation. He can't handle free people on his doorstep.
The Russians just want a guarantee that Ukraine won't join NATO. Zelensky signs the treaty, Putin's people sign the treaty, and Putin starts withdrawing the Russian troops in good faith. And what happens? Joe Biden sends Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, over to Ukraine in April and forces him to tear up the treaty. And since then, 450,000 kids have died who none of them should.
And do you know anything of history? Ukrainians have been struggling for centuries to be free, like the Irish people. And in many ways, unlike the Irish, Ukrainians have actually held on to their identity and their culture and their deep sense of freedom. If you claim to oppose corruption and tyranny, you cannot support Putin over Ukraine. It's something sick. And Mr. Kennedy, how can you claim to be on the side of people waking up to freedom in the U.S. when you so blithely support a tyrant who sends billions of dollars in missiles to destroy free cities day and night? I don't understand it. And, you know, we can talk more in the future about this. Ukraine it's a country of faith, family, freedom, tolerance, and tradition. Every American I know, whether they are conservative veterans from Afghanistan or liberal professors from Harvard who come here to Ukraine, are enamored by this society. They're sad when they leave. Yeah, there's plenty of problems as there are anywhere, but there's a spirit here. There's a freedom here. There's a freedom even in the conversations people have. You can be honest with each other. You can criticize the government. You criticize each other and still get along. There's a sense of solidarity, people working together. People do not trust corporations. They do not trust governments. Corporations do not control Ukrainian diet. On and on and on. Everything you're preaching, if you really believe it, you would stand with Ukraine. But at least maybe some Americans are waking up and realizing that those politicians in Washington who waved the flag of Ukraine and said they're supporting Ukraine aren't really supporting Ukraine. There's a reason why Joe Biden never talks about Ukraine's extraordinary Maidan revolution. And there's a reason why the Biden administration will not send long-range weapons to Ukraine and will not give Ukraine permission to hit military targets within Russia. Every time Ukraine does, they get chastised publicly by the U.S. Because the people in power in Washington also have an interest in a long war that does not result in freedom for Ukrainians. And by the way, Joe Biden was vice president when Putin took Crimea. And Obama-Biden administration did nothing to stop Putin. And meanwhile, Joe Biden's son was making money from a pal of Putin, the CEO of Burisma, who had been a part of the regime of Yanukovych in Kyiv that the people of Ukraine sent fleeing to Russia in that revolution of 2014. But the moment when Burisma started paying Joe Biden's son was after its CEO had left Ukraine and gone to Russia. And when Burisma was united with its gas fields in Crimea, when Putin took it, and then Burisma starts paying the son of the vice president, and the vice president and his boss, the president, do nothing to stop this, while the vice president's family is making money from a firm that is very close to Putin, that the people of Ukraine had kicked out of their country. I think you need to look a little more carefully into this. You have the money and the resources to do so.
Little Joe Lindsley.
Joe Lindsley is quickly becoming an American treasure in broadcasting.